Hey guys, tonight we begin with the sound of laughter, not yours, not mine, but the forced laughter of someone paid to survive by making kings chuckle. A tea echoed down marble corridors, the kind of laughter that had no joy in it. A chuckle rehearsed, a grin worn like armor. Somewhere behind it, a man or woman exhausted, clever, underestimated bowed for the 100th time before a face too powerful to disappoint. So before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. Let me know where you're tuning in from. What time is it where you are? Because tonight, we're not here for grand tales of battles or thrones. No, we're here for the quiet corners, the cold cellars and candlelit corridors. The bruised feet inside curled shoes. The stiff smiles. The ache behind the mask. In this medieval hush, we won't meet heroes, but we will meet the ones who waited, who served, who endured. There was the jester, yes, mocked and mocking, a strange kind of prisoner in motley. But also the cook who burned her hands on pots no one thanked her for. The boy who dreamed of horses but shined boots instead. The woman who prayed not for glory, but for warmth. The truth is, history isn't made in palaces. It's made in repetition. In tasks so mundane, they leave no record, and yet they shaped lives. Lives lived beneath heavy ceilings, beneath heavier expectations. And here's the quiet irony: sometimes the people closest to the crown were the ones furthest from comfort. The ones who wore bright colors while feeling dull. The ones who made others laugh while slowly forgetting how. So fluff your pillow or settle your blanket just a little higher. Let your eyes grow heavy as the candle of the day dims. And know that you're not alone. Not really. The world was always full of quiet, tired souls trying their best to stay warm, to stay useful, to stay kind. And so tonight, we'll follow the quiet footfalls of jesters, peasants, scribes, and monks, all bound not by fame, but by the ache of forgotten routines. There is a kind of silence that exists before performance. Not the excited hush of a theater crowd, but the cold, stretched silence of obligation. Stone walls press in. Tapestries shift slightly with the breath of winter air leaking through unseen cracks. A single bell rings somewhere in the castle, a sound that is not an invitation, but a summons. He knows that tone. He's heard it every day for years. It means the king is ready to laugh, and so the fool prepares. There's a rhythm to his dressing, though he wouldn't call it that. The bells on his cap do not jingle when he moves, not yet. His fingers are too practiced. He slides his thin arms into the bright, mismatched sleeves, colors chosen not for beauty, but for absurdity. Blue and yellow, red and green. A splash of ridiculousness in a court where everything else tries so hard to look composed. If you're enjoying this pace already, leave a soft like below and subscribe if you'd like more nights like this. He checks the mirror, or rather, a polished metal plate tacked above the wash basin. His smile is crooked, on purpose. He raises one eyebrow, tilts his head, lets his tongue rest against one cheek. There, the face is ready, but the man beneath it is not. Down the corridor, footsteps echo. Not his. Guards, maybe. Or stewards. Everyone moves an echo here. The walls. Catch everything and make it feel like someone is always listening, even when no one is. He walks through the hall like someone entering a chapel. Because, in a way, this is sacred in its own twisted way. The throne room is a place of ritual, not religion, but reverence nonetheless. Every eye turns when he enters, not out of respect, but because they've been told to. He bows, low, not with grace, but with exaggeration. His spine curves like a question mark. His nose nearly touches the stone. The bells on his hat finally give in and jingle. A pathetic little sound that makes the nobles chuckle. It begins. His voice is high and strange, an accent of his own invention. His jokes are rehearsed, the rhythm precise. But he pretends to fumble. He trips over syllables, gasps dramatically, rolls his eyes until only the whites show. The courtiers laugh. So does the king. That's what matters, because if the king laughs, the fool eats, and if the king doesn't, well, there are stories about the last fool. No one talks about him now. Some days, the jester is given meat. Sometimes coin. On rare days, both. But more often, he receives what he values most, silence. A short bow from the king. A nod. Permission to leave. He never walks quickly when dismissed. That would look eager. He never lingers either. That would look arrogant. So he glides. Just enough to seem untethered. Just enough to remind them all, I am not like you. I am not one of you. But in the evening, when the candles sputter and the gowns are shed, and the crown rests on its velvet pillow, the jester, too, removes his costume. And what remains is neither funny nor foolish. It's just a man. Thin. Quiet. His knees ache from kneeling. His jaw hurts from smiling. He eats alone. In his chambers if he's lucky. In the kitchen if he's not. The kitchen staff do not mock him. They barely look at him. To them, he is just another role among many, like the chambermaid or the dog trainer. A function. Not a person. He doesn't mind. It's safer that way. At tea night, he lies on his straw-stuffed mattress and stares at the beams above. He counts them. 1, 2, 3. Always the same. Until his eyes go heavy and his fingers curl into the hem of his sleeve, still bright, still absurd. Even in the dark, sleep, when it comes, is dreamless. Or if he dreams, he never remembers. In the morning, he wakes before the bell. Not from habit, but from dread. There is a moment, just one, when the world is still, and he forgets who he is. Then the cold reminds him, and the bell rings. He stands. He bows to no one, and he begins again. There are smiles that come from joy. And then there are the others, the kind you stretch across your face like a mask that no longer fits. The kind you wear not to express emotion, but to prevent it. He wakes. Before dawn again, not because he must, but because sleep never stays long. The straw beneath him is damp tonight. The air is colder than it should be. His blanket is more whole than cloth, and yet he tucks it around his knees as if that will matter. It doesn't, but rituals are everything. He stands slowly. Knees first, then spine. He rolls his neck. He hums a little tune. Not because it cheers him, but because silence is a void, and voids make the mind wander. He glances at his costume folded neatly on the stool. Its colors are still bright, still ridiculous. Somehow, even the mice don't bother it. Perhaps even they think it unappetizing. He doesn't put it on just yet. Not until the moment demands it. Instead, he walks to the tiny window set high in the stone. It doesn't open, but through it, he sees sky bruised gray with the first pink of morning bleeding in. That's the moment he chooses his face, the smile not too wide. That would be unsettling. Not too flat. That would be dangerous. He practices once, twice, then lets it settle, a soft curl of the lips, a twitch of the cheek, an upward tilt of the eyes, as if everything is just slightly amusing. It's not. But they expect it to be, and when you live by making others laugh, your own feelings become optional. He remembers once, long ago, or maybe it was a dream, being a child and laughing until it hurt. Real laughter. The kind that makes your ribs ache and your eyes water. The kind you can't stop even when you want to. He hasn't had that kind of laugh in years, maybe lifetimes. Now his laughter is measured, controlled. A currency. It's not just for the king anymore. It's for the chambermaid who looks at him with pity, for the guard who likes to test how far a joke can be pushed before it becomes an insult, for the noblewomen who laugh too loudly at his wit, never realizing the sharpness was meant for them. Each laugh is a chess move, each smirk a veil. He's not the only one who does it, of course. The castle is full of smiles. Some are painted on with rouge, some drawn tight with fear. But his is different. His is weaponized, because when words are all you have, and even those must be spoken in riddles, you learn to sharpen them, to coat them in sugar, to slip them between the cracks of formality, like daggers made of air. They call him fool, but they listen. Even the king listens, sometimes when the room is loud and the music is playing, and his bells are ringing in time with the lute. He sees the faces in the crowd shift. A joke lands, but not quite the way they expected. Eyes narrow. A nobleman's hand tightens around his goblet. A whisper stirs. Did he mean that? He always smiles. What power he holds is not in command, but in confusion. In that moment, when the powerful feel briefly foolish and laugh anyway, because what is more dangerous than a man who knows all your secrets and hides behind a grin? He's learned to survive on this tension, to tiptoe along its edges like a dancer on ice, but it's not without cost. Each night, after the crowd disperses and the wine-stained linens are removed, he retreats not to applause, but to solitude. No one follows the jester home. No one asks what he needs. No one sees him. When he wipes the paint from his face with the sleeve of his own tunic, the room is silent. The fire, if it burns, is small. He doesn't light it often. Smoke draws attention, and he prefers the cold. Now it's honest. His smile fades when he is alone, but the muscles remember. Sometimes he finds himself grinning into the darkness, not because he wants to, but because his face forgot how not to. He sits in the silence and listens to the castle breathe, the distant sounds of others living different lives, the creak of the wind through stone, the soft sob of a woman down the hall who thinks no one can hear. They're all smiling too, in their way, and yet they all remain quiet, because here, in these walls, silence is safer than truth. He lies back down. He folds his arms. He closes his eyes. In the morning, they will ask for more jokes, for another laugh, another rhyme, another performance. And he will give it, not because he loves it, not even because it keeps him alive, but because the silence that follows is sweeter than applause. And in that silence, for just a breath, he feels real. There is a kind of cold that doesn't bite, it seeps. It begins in the toes, curls through the knees, and wraps itself around the spine like a damp shawl. It's not violent. It's quiet, patient, like a secret never spoken aloud. This is the cold of the lower halls, the cold of the places where heat is never invited, the cold of the kitchen cellars, and down here, beneath the weight of stone floors and noble footsteps, bread is born. Not the golden loaves sung about in songs, but the kind that breaks rather than bends. Heavy, flat, dry bread, made from flour swept off dusty boards. Bread made for the hands of people who cannot afford hunger. The girl wakes before the bell, not from habit, but from the cold. The straw in her corner has frozen stiff along the edges. Her fingers are pink, her breath visible. Her shoes are still wet from yesterday. She stands and stretches. The joints pop. A reminder that she's getting older, even if the others still call her child. The kitchen is never empty, not really. Someone is always there stoking coals, boiling bones, checking barrels. Today, it's her turn to see to the bread. The dough has been resting overnight. If the rats haven't taken to it, it should still rise. She enters the cellar like someone stepping into a cathedral. The stillness is sacred. The smell is old flour, rot, onions, and something sour that no one can identify, but everyone accepts. Her candle is weak, but enough. She kneels by the covered bowl, lifts the cloth. The dough has risen. Just enough, a small win. One she won't speak of, but will carry with her all day. She moves through the tasks with practiced, quiet, floured hands. Needed rhythm. The table rocks slightly, but she knows where to place her elbow to keep it still. These are the things that matter when no one is watching. Above her, the castle stretches upward in layers. Laughter echoes faintly from far-off chambers. Boots scrape stone in corridors she will never walk. A roast is already being prepared for a feast she'll never taste, but down here, she shapes bread with knuckles hardened by years of flour and fire. Sometimes she thinks of what it must be like to eat bread that is soft, fresh, sweet. She's heard of such things. Honey drizzled on warm crusts. Butter that doesn't taste like salt and smoke. Bread that is given, not rationed, but those are thoughts for later. Today, there are mouths to feed. None of them hers. The oven is ancient. Its door creaks like a tired old man. The fire must be coaxed, flattered, persuaded like a fussy cat, unwilling to wake. She knows the trick. A twist of straw, a whisper of breath, and patience, always patience. The bread goes in, one rough shape at a time. No perfection, just enough, and while it bakes, she waits. She hums, maybe, a song her mother used to hum. Or maybe she's forgotten the tune and just hums out of habit. Either way, it comforts her. Even if it doesn't change the cold, the rats scurry nearby. Bold now, as always. She doesn't flinch. They're part of the room, like the shelves or the mold. One watches her, with beady eyes as she wipes the table down. She stares back. They've made a kind of truce, she and the rats. They take what they can. She hides what she must. No one wins, but no one starves. The bread comes out dark around the edges, cracked on top. She brushes the bottoms with her apron, knocks away the ash. The smell is earthy, good even. She knows who will get what. The steward gets the best loaf, the guards the next best. The scraps go to the stable hands. She takes nothing, not even a corner crust. Someone once asked her why she doesn't sneak a bite. She just smiled, because it's not about honesty. It's about hope. If she takes a bite today, she might take one tomorrow. And soon, the bread won't stretch far. Enough. And someone poorer than even her will go without so she doesn't. Instead, she washes the bowl, scalds her hands in the water, wipes it dry with the same cloth she used yesterday and the day before, folds it precisely, places it back where it belongs. There is no praise. No one comes to thank her. There is no song written for the girl who feeds 100 without feeding herself. But when the bell rings for the midday meal and the trays are carried upward, she stands quietly in the cellar, hands raw, lips dry, and watches the crumbs drift to the floor. The rats are already gathering. She lets them. It's only fair. Then she turns, steps back into the chill, and begins preparing the flour for tomorrow, because down here, in the cold and silence, bread must always rise. Not everyone died of the plague. Some died from fear long before the fever. ever reached them. Some lived, but not without losing something quieter, harder to name. A voice. A faith. A reason to open the shutters in the morning. The village had gone silent. Not suddenly. Not all at once. But gradually, like the way winter closes in. First, the laughter stopped. Then the visits. Then the markets. Until finally, all that remained were locked doors, shuttered windows, and the heavy smell of ash drifting through narrow lanes. She wasn't sick. Her skin was clear. Her breath steady. No swelling in the neck. No black spots blooming on her chest. She had checked. Twice. Every morning. But that didn't make her safe. It only made her watched. Her neighbors had learned not to trust health. The baker's wife was healthy too. Until she wasn't. She'd been sweeping her doorstep one morning, smiling at the priest. By nightfall, her body was stiff in the wagon, and her children wouldn't come near the window. That's how fast it came. So now, no one smiled. No one waved. A nod, if you were lucky. A glance from behind a curtain. But mostly, people stayed inside. Even when they weren't yet dying, she kept busy. That helped. There was always wood to stack, water to carry, bread to bake that no one would eat. She made broth out of bone and garlic, though her appetite was long gone. She swept the floor 3 times a day, not because it needed it, but because it filled the silence. She did not speak aloud. Not even to herself. Words had weight now. Breath had consequence. Even prayer was whispered into folded cloth. Once, a dog barked in the distance, and she wept from the sound of it. It reminded her that life still made noise somewhere. Just not here. They hadn't burned the bodies yet. There were too many, and not enough firewood. So they waited. They piled them outside the chapel, wrapped in old sheets, marked with chalk. She walked past them once, carrying a pail of water. She didn't look, but she smelled it. Death has a smell, like rotting apples and wet iron. You never forget it. And though her steps were steady, her hands shook until the water sloshed out of the bucket and soaked the hem of her dress. She did not cry. She hadn't cried in days. Even tears felt dangerous now. Like an invitation. Like proof you still had something to lose. The plague didn't knock on doors. It seeped under them. It curled through cracks in the stone. It clung to coins and cloaks. In careless hands, she kept a rag soaked in vinegar near the door. She hung garlic in bunches from the rafters, even though it didn't work. The priest said so, but she did it anyway, because the truth was harder to bear than the illusion of control. And at night, she slept with a candle burning, though the wax was nearly gone. She couldn't sleep in darkness. Not now. In darkness, thoughts became shapes. Shadows became symptoms. She dreamt of coughing, of footsteps, of shallow graves. She would wake with her heart racing and her mouth dry and press her palm to her forehead. Still cool, still alive. Then she'd wait, sometimes until dawn, sometimes longer. She missed the sound of her mother's voice, of her sister's laughter. But they were gone now, taken last week. Or was it longer? Time moved strangely these days, slow and yet evaporating. The room was still as they'd left it. 2 beds, one unused. A shawl folded on a chair. A single braid of brown hair tied with red ribbon, still resting on the windowsill like a relic. She couldn't bring herself to move it. The silence had weight now. Not peace, heaviness. Like breathing through cloth. Like being buried slowly, not by dirt, but by routine. No one came to collect her. No one accused her. She was not the cause. She was not the cure. She was simply there breathing in a house that had forgotten the sound of conversation, and that, too, was its own kind of death. Survival, when surrounded by loss, is not victory. It is duty. It is burden. It is knowing how many empty chairs are in the room when you sit to eat. She still set the table for 3. Still lit 3 candles. Still poured 3 bowls of broth. It wasn't hope. It wasn't madness. It was memory made tangible, made routine, and when she whispered her prayers into the dark, not for salvation, not for strength, but simply for stillness, she always ended the same way. Let me wake tomorrow, not healthy, not joyful, just awake, and somehow, she always did, but with each new morning, the world outside was quieter than before. There's a particular silence inside stone walls, not the silence of peace, but of containment. The kind that thickens with each echo. The kind that hums against the skin like a warning, even when nothing stirs. The scriptorium was not a place of conversation. It was a place of ink, dust, and hours that melted into one another until time became a concept only monks discussed in metaphors, and in the center of it all sat a man nameless, faceless to history, hunched over a sheet of stretched parchment. With a quill in hand and a prayer on his lips, the room was dim, lit only by narrow beams of sunlight slicing through high slits in the wall. A flicker of gold here, a glow of white there enough to see the page, but never enough to warm the bones. The table before him was worn smooth by decades of elbows and palms. Tiny knife marks in the wood told stories no tongue dared speak. Each notch was a moment, a cough, a pause, a breath held between syllables. He dipped the quill slowly into the inkwell. Thick black ink, cold and patient, clung to the feather's tip, and then he began. The letters emerged not quickly, but reverently. Not as communication, but as obedience. Each one curved like a whisper. Each space measured. Each line identical to the last. This was not writing. This was worship. The words were not his. They were the words of saints, popes, kings. He merely copied. Page after page, year after year. It had been weeks since he last saw a tree. Months since he heard laughter that wasn't muffled through walls. Years since he had written anything of his own. If you're still settling in, maybe leave a quiet like on this video and consider subscribing only if it feels right. Outside, the world changed with the seasons. Inside, every day was the same. He ate when the bell rang, slept when the candle burned too low, prayed because there was nothing else to do with the parts of the day not already claimed by ink. His fingers were always stained a bluish black. Under the nails, in the creases of his knuckles. The skin had grown calloused and cracked from years of parchment, cold air, and repetition. Sometimes in the quietest hours, he imagined letting the ink spill just once. A single drop. A smudge across the word of God, but he never did. Instead, he fixed the angle of the nib, adjusted the parchment, continued. The walls around him were lined with the work of those who came before. Illuminated manuscripts with gilded borders, saints painted in robes more radiant than the sun ever looked through monastery windows. Some pages were works of art. Others were simple, neat, obedient, lifeless. He preferred the lifeless ones. They asked nothing of him. Once, when he was younger, he had hidden a poem behind a binding. Just a few lines. Nothing bold. Just a thought that wouldn't leave him, about the way light fell on the floor in winter. About how beauty didn't need permission. He never told anyone. He never looked for it again. He didn't need to. It was enough to know it was there. Now, older, he didn't write poems anymore. But he still noticed the light. Still paused when a bird landed on the sill, even if he didn't lift his head. And once a week, if no one was watching, he'd take the leftover ink, and on a scrap of discarded parchment, he'd practice writing a word that was not in the scriptures, his. Name.it felt strange every time. Too short. Too soft. Unworthy of the ink it used, he kept those scraps hidden. Not from fear, but from the quiet knowledge that someday his name would vanish, but the words he copied would remain. There's something both comforting and crushing in that. Outside the scriptorium, the world suffered from cold, hunger, war, plague. But here, suffering was slower, softer. It came not as pain, but as repetition.as days that looked like each other, as ink that ran dry, and fingers that forgot what it felt like to make something new. He didn't resist it. There was no rebellion in his body, only rhythm. He wasn't a prisoner, not exactly, but the feather quill was his shackle, the parchment, his walls, the vow of silence, his lock and key, and yet there was beauty in it, in the curve of a letter, in the balance of a page, and knowing that even if no one ever spoke his name, they would speak the words he had copied. Again and again, long after he was dust, he closed the book carefully, blew on the ink to dry it, pressed it with a cloth, tied the leather string with steady hands. Then he stood. His knees cracked softly. His back resisted. The candle had burned low. His breath fogged in the air. Tomorrow, he would begin a new page. And the day after that, another, until he became a footnote, buried not in history. But between lines of scripture, there is a sound softer than whispering. Softer even than breath.it is the scratching of quills on parchment, thousands of them in rows, in rhythm. And silence.it doesn't echo. It doesn't demand. It simply exists, a tapestry of noise woven by hands that never speak. In the monastery, the scriptorium stretched wide, but never felt open. Arched ceilings held shadows. Long wooden desks lined the stone floor, each one lit by narrow slivers of daylight or the weak flicker of tallow candles, and at those desks they sat, dozens of men, bowed heads, bent spines, fingers stained with ink, lips stitched closed not by thread, but by duty. No one spoke. That was the first rule. Here, words were not for the air, they were for the page, and only those deemed holy approved. Unchanging, the air was thick with cold and concentration. You could hear the weight of thought in every shallow breath. You could feel the silence not as emptiness, but as pressure. Like snow piled on a roof that never collapses, only sags with time, they wrote in unison, not by sound, but by rhythm, like monks breathing together. Like a body made of many hands, the scratching never stopped. Even when the bells rang for prayer, even when the wind howled outside like a dying animal, the scratching continued, a low symphony of obedience. Sometimes the ink froze in the inkwells. They would warm it with breath or cradle it in their hands. Not to complain, there was no room for complaint, but because the work could not stop. The word had to be preserved, not understood, not felt, just preserved. They copied scriptures, sermons, edicts, ledgers, names of saints they would never meet, laws they would never break, histories they would never live to see. They wrote not with inspiration, but with precision, each letter identical, each line perfect, each mistake scraped away with a knife as though it had never existed. But mistakes did happen, sometimes a tremor, a blot, a missing mark above an eye, and then silence would deepen, heads would lower, and a soft penance would follow. Extra fasting, longer prayer, fewer comforts, because here error was not human. It was spiritual. There was a brother no one remembered his name who once copied the same verse 27 times across a single page before noticing. They say he wept, not out of guilt, but because it meant starting again. That was the cost of silence. If you're enjoying this pace already, leave a soft like below and subscribe if you'd like more nights like this. And yet, for all its repetition, all its sameness, the work did something strange to the men. It made them still. It made them small. It made them disappear, not in a cruel way, but in a gentle one. Like a candle flickering lower, not from wind, but because the night had simply deepened, they didn't mind. Many of them came here to vanish. Outside these walls, there were plagues, taxes, wars, lords who barked orders and peasants who cried for bread. But here, inside the stone cocoon of ink and paper, there was only the line, the curve, the steady rhythm of silent devotion. Some of them, in secret, added little things, a face in the margin, a flower tucked behind a saint's ear, a bird hidden in the scrollwork. Not rebellion, not mischief, just humanity. One monk drew a cat curled beside a crucifix. Another sketched a fly in the corner of the page so real. Another monk tried to brush it away. These were the small joys, the hidden jokes, the signs that beneath the silence, someone was still alive. At mealtime, they sat together, but still didn't speak. The food was simple. Broth, crusts, sometimes cheese. They chewed slowly, thoughtfully, as if even the act of eating required precision, and afterward, they would return to the desks, to the ink, to the page, to the scratching. It's said that the world was built by kings and torn apart by war, but preserved by hands like these, by men no one would remember, men whose names were never written in the books they copied. When one of them died, there was no great mourning, just a gap at the table, a new set of hands to take up the quill. The scratching continued, always. Sometimes late at night, one would pause, just for a moment. His eyes would blur, his fingers would twitch. He'd stare down at the word he had written, the same word he'd copied 100 times before, and for just a second, it would feel like it belonged to him, not God, not the abbot, him. And then he'd lower his head again, dip the quill, and write on, because this was what life looked like when it had been flattened into obedience. Not cruel, just quiet. The scratching was not a cry. It was not even a whisper, but it was there, and for as long as it lasted, the world still had order, still had meaning, still had someone, somewhere, writing it all down. Some crafts are loud, hammered into shape with fire and sweat. Others are quiet, so quiet they leave no echo. The tailor's work was of the second kind, stitch by stitch. In a corner near the hearth, he shaped the world not with force, but with thread. Bent over dull fabric in fading light, he sewed dignity into seams and sorrow into sleeves. His world was not made of silk and elegance, as stories would suggest, but of wool that itched and linen that tore. And his tools no jeweled scissors or shining thimbles, but simple ones, rusted at the hinge, softened by use. He was not noble, not even close, but nobles wore what he made. Dukes and dames paraded through the halls in coats sewn with his fingers, trousers stitched by candlelight, gowns hemmed by a man who would never be allowed to touch the arm of a woman who wore them. That was the irony. His work was noble, even when he was not. He slept beside his needle, not from pride, from need. Because if you lose the needle, the thread is just thread. Useless. The nights were cold, as always. The hearth in his workroom spat more smoke than heat. Still he sat close, not for comfort, but for light. Wool cloaks don't stitch themselves, and winter does not wait. Most days He worked until his fingers cramped. Then he'd stretch them against the wood of the table, one joint at a time. Before returning to the thread, the fabric spoke its own language. Coarse meant stable. Soft meant fragile. The thread pulled tight meant a garment would last a winter. Too loose, and it would tear before it ever saw rain. He'd learned to sew from his mother, long gone now. She stitched until her eyesight vanished, then taught him how to feel the thread instead of seeing it. Sometimes he still closed his eyes when he worked. He swore he was faster that way. If you're still settling in, maybe leave a quiet like on this video and consider subscribing only if it feels right. There were days when the requests piled up faster than he could manage. A lord's hunting doublet. A page's new tunic. Repairs on a bishop's robe that smelled faintly of incense and sweat. And then, when he was already behind, someone would bring him a child's dress, torn on a nail, and ask sheepishly if he could fix it before nightfall. He always did, not because he had time, but because the child would need it for warmth, and warmth, unlike fashion, could not be delayed. He rarely spoke as he worked. What was there to say? The thread didn't care for conversation. The garments didn't argue, but his hands told stories. Through the weight of each hem, the tension in each cuff, the extra stitch he added to the shoulder seam so it wouldn't split in a storm. These were his prayers. He sewed into the night, the flame of the candle flickering against the edges of his vision. Sometimes he imagined the thread as a lifeline, pulled through fabric to hold something together that might otherwise unravel. There was always something unraveling. He himself was coming apart slowly. A pain in his back, a stiffness in the knees, fingers that no longer moved like they used to. But the work continued, because if he didn't sew, someone would go without. And that thought was worse than the ache. He never signed his work. There were no marks, no crests, no initials hidden in the folds. Just stitches, invisible to the eye, but strong enough to hold a cloak against the wind, dotted to the end of each day. He folded his work and placed it in a wooden chest. He brushed the table clean, coiled his thread, kissed his fingertips, a habit not from superstition, but from gratitude. Then he would blow out the candle and sit a moment longer. In the dark, there was no applause, no banquet, no toast to the tailor who kept the frost off the shoulders of the proud, just silence, and the soft rustle of fabric settling into place. Once, long ago, someone had asked him if he ever wished for more. More wealth, more fame, a shop of his own. He'd only smiled and pointed to a patched cloak hanging by the door. A patch no one noticed. Because it had been sewn well, that was enough for him. Datio fixed something so well, it vanished. Datio repair what others thought ruined. Datio stitch. In the dark, without glory, but with purpose. And so he slept, beside his needle, dreaming, if he ever dreamed at all, not of riches but of warm backs, dry shoulders, and hems that held through rain. Before gold, there was wool, not because it glittered, or dazzled, or turned heads in court, but because it lasted. It warmed the body. It lined the coffers. It moved kingdoms without ever drawing a sword. Wool was wealth, and wealth was rarely worn by the ones who made it. In the early morning, before the mist lifted from the hills, the shepherd rose. He stretched his arms, cracked his back, and listened for bleating in the distance. It was not the sound of beauty or nobility. It was the sound of survival. His boots were soaked before he reached the first stone wall. The ground was never dry. Not really. Not in the places where sheep thrived, and so his steps squelched through the pasture, each one colder than the last. His cloak, if you could call it, that was made from scraps. Wool too coarse for nobles. too stiff to spin fine. It was warm, but barely, and it smelled of the very animals it came from. He didn't mind. He had stopped smelling the sheep years ago. The animals were skittish that morning. Perhaps a fox in the night. Perhaps nothing. Sometimes they just spooked for the sake of it like people. He moved among them slowly. A hand on one flank. A low word. The sheep knew his voice, knew the feel of him. He wasn't cruel, and in return, they gave him their silence, and once. A year their wool, the shearing came in spring. But it was always on his mind, because wool was not just a product. It was a promise. It promised coin. It promised trade. It promised a winter not quite as cold as the last, but it never promised warmth for him. The best wool went to the lords, to the merchants, to the tailors in faraway cities who wove it into cloaks sold at 5 times their worth. His family wore the leftovers, if anything at all. Frayed cuffs, scratchy collars, mittens patched with twine. Warmth was a luxury. Wool was a currency. And the two did not always meet at home. His wife spun what she could. Her will creaked with every turn. Her hands moved as if in prayer. Thread, tension, wind. Repeat. A dance older than memory, she spun by the fire, but the fire was small. Fed by sticks too thin, coals too tired. Still, she sang as she worked. A soft melody. Wordless. The hum of someone doing what must be done. The children played nearby, or slept, or watched with the stillness only hunger can teach. The wool she spun would be sold, or traded, or collected by the steward with his 2 clean boots and his parchment scroll. They never kept the best of it, because the steward didn't care that the baby's blanket was thinning, that the wind whistled through the cracks in the wall, that sometimes frost bit toes in the night and didn't let go. He only cared for weight, texture, purity, not for warmth. And so the shepherd's wife spun, and the shepherd walked miles a day in boots lined with straw, through wind, through rain, through fog that curled like smoke around his ankles. Sometimes he dreamed of a coat, a real one, heavy, lined, soft at the collar. He had seen one once on a visiting nobleman. It shimmered in the firelight like river water. It looked warm, but dreams-like that were dangerous. Better to dream of smaller things. A dry night, a stronger fire. Bread without weevils. If you're enjoying this pace already, leave a soft like below and subscribe if you'd like more nights. Like this, one day, while mending a fence, he nicked his palm on a rusty nail. The cut was shallow, but it bled. He wiped it on his cloak, watched the red stain spread across the wool. Then he laughed quietly, because in that moment he realized the truth. Wool, for him, was never protection. It was a burden, a debt, a thing grown from his labor, sold by someone else, worn by someone richer, and never returned. And yet still, he loved it, loved the feel of it between his fingers, the smell of it after rain, the way the sheep leaned into his legs when frightened, the way spun yarn felt warm even before it touched a fire, because sometimes even the things that betray you are still yours. Night, he lay beside his wife, beneath a quilt that barely covered them both. Her spinning was silent now, her hand resting on his chest. They didn't speak. There was nothing to say. The fire cracked once, weakly. Outside, the sheep were huddled together, a living mass of breath and fleece, and the stars shone down with indifference. But inside, there was warmth. Not from wool, but from love, and for that night, at least, it was enough. There are journeys no one writes about. No dragons, no triumphs, no tales of arrival. Just mud and cold. And the steady ache of moving forward because no one else will. The road wasn't really a road. Not the kind you'd imagine. Not paved. Not even dry dot. It was a trail worn by hooves, cart wheels, and feet too poor to leave tracks anywhere else. And today, someone had to walk it. A man or a boy, it didn't matter. He pulled his cloak tighter and stared ahead, where the village path bent toward trees that always looked closer than they were. Behind him, the roof of his cottage sagged, under the weight of spring rain. Ahead town, he had to go. There was grain to collect. Salt, if he was lucky. Maybe a strip of dried meat, though he didn't hold out hope. They'd gone without for days already. The children at home were quieter now. That wasn't a good sign. The mud reached his ankles by the second mile. Sticky, deep, unwilling to let go. Each step was a small negotiation. He stopped once to pull off a shoe and scrape out a stone. The leather was cracked, more whole than sole. He considered going barefoot, but the road was cruel. Sharp when dry, icy when wet, and always indifferent. A cart passed, pulled by a horse too thin to name. The man riding didn't stop, just nodded barely, one traveler acknowledging, another in the shared misery of movement, because the road didn't care why you were walking it. Only that you did. The hedgerows were blooming now, small flowers brave enough to bloom in muck. He noticed them, not because he was soft, but because they were a kind of defiance. Beauty in a place where beauty had no business growing. His cloak dragged behind him, wet and heavier by the hour. Rain began to fall again, a soft mist at first, then a steadier drizzle that found every seam in his clothes and slid down the back of his neck like a warning. The worst part wasn't the wet. It was the silence out here. There were no voices, no music, no dogs barking from porches. Only the slosh of mud beneath foot and the distant caw of something overhead. He used to walk this road with others during feast days or weddings or harvest. Laughter, stories, shared baskets. But those days felt distant now. Another life. Now he walked alone. Because someone had to. He passed a dead bird in the ditch. Then a broken wheel. Then nothing. For a very long time, the cold worked its way. Into his joints, not sharp, just persistent. Like guilt. Like memory. It didn't stab. It settled. And once it settled, it didn't leave. He thought of his wife, hunched over the fire. Of his daughter's cracked lips. Of the way his son had asked gently if they might taste honey this spring, maybe. If the bees survived the frost. If the steward wasn't cruel this year. If he could make it to town and back. The sun was already leaning westward. It was never high this time of year. Just a dull light that followed him reluctantly. By the time he reached the village, he could barely feel his toes. His hands ached from being clenched so long around his belt. He traded quietly, spoke only when needed, gave more than he received. That was the rule. 1 coin for flour, half a coin for a stub of cheese. Salt was out. They'd had a flood last month, and the barrels were ruined. He settled for onions and regret on the way home. The road was somehow worse. The ruts deeper, the puddles colder, the wind less forgiving, but his pack was heavier now. And that made all the difference. He paused near the same hedgerow where the tiny flowers still stood defiant. He reached out gently and picked one. It wouldn't last the walk. It would wilt before he got home. But still, he carried it, because sometimes something small, something pointless, is the only thing that makes the road feel shorter. if you're enjoying this pace already. Leave a soft like below and subscribe if you'd like more nights like this. His cottage door creaked when he pushed. It opened. The fire had burned low, but was not out. His wife looked up, eyes ringed with tiredness, but full of welcome. The children didn't speak, just leaned in close as he unpacked the food they would eat tonight. Not much, but enough, and as he pulled the wilted flour from his cloak pocket and placed it in a small cup near the fire, his daughter smiled. The kind of smile that cost nothing and yet meant everything. The road had been long, ugly, cruel, but he had returned. And for tonight, that was enough. The sound came before the light, long before dawn reached the village, before the rooster stirred, before even the wind remembered to move. There was the ringing, steel on steel. A slow, patient rhythm. Not music. Not yet. But something like a dot in the corner of the village, where the road split toward the mill and the market. The forge glowed. Faintly. A soft red hum pulsing through the cracks in its shuttered walls. As if the building breathed. As if the fire inside had a life of its own, and maybe it did. He was there, of course. The blacksmith. Already at the anvil. Already awake. And no one remembered when he last slept. He didn't look tired exactly. But there was a slowness to him now. Not sluggish, steady. As if every movement had been considered 1,000 times before. He raised the hammer again and again and again, not in anger, not with flourish, but with the patience of someone who knew that haste broke things more often than it built them. The blade beneath his hands glowed orange. Its edges trembled in the cool morning air. He turned it, tapped once, then twice. The shape came slowly, coaxed out of metal that resisted change. A T wasn't a sword, not this time. Not anything glorious, just a plow hook. Bent wrong by a careless farmer. And needed by tomorrow. He didn't mind. The hammer was warm in his grip. Familiar. Worn smooth where his hand had shaped it over the years. The anvil had dents where no book said there should be dents. But he knew them all. They helped him work faster. Straighter. Safer. The forge roared behind him. Obedient. It asked nothing except to be fed. Wood, coal, bellows, and in return. It gave him the heat he needed. Not comfort. Just enough. He hadn't slept last night. Or the night before. There had been a wheel rim to mend. Nails to shape. A dozen hinges ordered by the steward for the barn doors at the manor. He'd meant to rest, but the fire was still hot. And the silence was kind. And sometimes the world made more sense when it was glowing. Sleep was soft. Sleep was kind. But sleep was optional. Iron was not. He paused once to wipe his brow. The cloth was blackened with soot and sweat. His arms ached. His eyes burned. But the metal still glowed, and his hand still remembered what to do. At the edge of his bench sat a plate of bread, uneaten. Cold. His wife had brought it hours ago. Or was it yesterday? She no longer asked him to come in. She simply left the bread, kissed the doorframe, and let him be. She understood. Not the work, maybe, but the weight of it. The way some men are shaped by their labor, and how others disappear. Inside it, he wasn't angry. He wasn't sad. He wasn't even proud. He was working. That was all, and in a world where so much was uncertain, that was something. If you're still settling in, maybe leave a quiet like on this video, and consider subscribing only if it feels right. The village would wake soon. He would hear footsteps, buckets being filled, doors opening, carts being dragged into the square. The day would arrive, as it always did, without fanfare, without apology, and someone would come eventually, a boy or a man, holding something broken, they always came because everything broke eventually. And everyone needed the blacksmith. He was the end of every story, the one who fixed what others ruined. The ring of the hammer would echo through the streets. Birds would pause mid-song. Children would laugh and mimic the sound with stones. Old women would nod and say, "He's at it again," and by evening the broken thing would be whole. Stronger even. If he'd done it right, but tonight, or was it morning now? He worked alone, in the glow, in the hush, in the warmth only a fire could offer. The plow hook was nearly done. One more bend, one more tap, one more breath held between hammer. Strokes, he cooled it in water. The hiss filled the room like steam rising from the soul. He set it on the bench, cleaned his hands, rubbed his eyes. Outside, the sky had turned soft with early light, pale blue reaching upward, timid and unsure. He looked at the bread, ate 2 bites, no more, then stood. There were hinges to shape, a gate to repair, a horseshoe missing from the stallion up the hill. The day was waiting, and so was the metal, and though sleep called softly from some distant corner of his mind, it was not louder than the clang of steel. So he picked up the hammer again and forgot once more. To sleep, some things die with a scream. Others die slowly with time, with damp, with neglect. Rust belongs to the second kind. It creeps. It lingers. It grows like moss across what was once strong, not in defiance, but in quiet persistence. A reminder that even the toughest iron cannot escape softness in the end. In the blacksmith's shed, rust was everywhere, on tools left too long in the corner, on hinges stacked for fixing, on a sword that hadn't seen battle or light in years. It flacked in soft curls. It painted the edges of iron in orange and red, like autumn leaves never swept, but no one cursed it here, not the blacksmith, not his apprentice, not the farmer who came looking for a new hook, because rust was not failure. It was just time, and time touched everything. The boy, the apprentice, ran his fingers along a curved blade one morning. It had belonged to someone once, maybe a soldier, maybe just a man who thought he'd need it. Now it slept under dust and memory. The edge was dull, the hilt stiff, but still it held something, a story perhaps, or the shadow of one. Should I clean it? The boy asked. The blacksmith shook his head. Not yet, because sometimes rust is a teacher. It tells you where the metal lived, where it bent, where it broke. He'd learned that long ago. He remembered the first tool he ever made, a chisel, too short, too soft. It had rusted before the year was out, but he'd kept it, wrapped it in cloth and tucked it under a floorboard, not out of pride, but to remember that rust was his beginning. In the village, people brought him things not just for repair, but for memory. A key from a door that no longer stood, a bell from a goat long gone, nails pulled from a barn they'd had to burn. All rusted, all useless, but all beloved. He never said no. He'd polish them gently, give them back in a cloth, and they'd be tucked into drawers or altars or pockets, not because they were needed, but because they had survived and survival. Even rusted was holy. In the damp months, the forge itself rusted. The hinges on the coal bin, the latch on the shutter, the tools near the door. He wiped them down when he could, oiled what he had time for. But some rust he left, a kind of companion. It reminded him of the limits, that even the strongest metal has edges, weakness, season, and that's what made it beautiful. If you're enjoying this pace already, leave a soft like below and subscribe if you'd like more nights like this. He told the boy once, as they worked side by side, "Rust is just metal remembering the earth." The boy didn't understand yet, but he would, because in time, even the hammer shows rust at the head. Even the anvil's face wears smooth, not from failure, but from devotion. The old men in the village had rust in their bones. Knees that creaked, backs that stiffened in the rain. They walked with the same stubborn rhythm as a blade dulled by decades of use, and yet they still carried firewood, still raised cups, still knelt to plant seed. Rust, they knew, wasn't the end. It was just proof you'd been used, touched, needed. Out in the fields, the tools were all rusted by summer's end. The scythes, the plows, the chains left on fences. The rain got to them, as it always did. But the farmers never wept for that. They brought them back, one by one, not ashamed, just realistic. Can you sharpen it? Can you patch the blade? Can you bring it back? The blacksmith always could, or tried to. Some metal couldn't be saved, but most could. Under the rust, something solid always waited. He showed the boy how to scrape gently, not too deep, not too fast. Let the edge find itself again. Let the iron remember what it once was, and when the edge returned, sharp and bright, the blacksmith would nod, softly, proudly, not because it was perfect, but because it had come back. That was enough. In the evenings, when the forge dimmed and the tools cooled, he would walk the shop slowly, touch each piece, whisper a name or a memory. He never feared the rust. He welcomed it, wiped it when he could, honored it when he couldn't, because rust meant contact. Rust meant use. Rust meant life had passed through here, and in a world where so much was broken and thrown away, rust, at least, stayed. So he let it stay too. Some revolutions wear armor, some carry swords, and some wear aprons, carry mugs, and know exactly how much barley to add for a stronger brew. She was an alewife, not a noble title, not a profession praised in songs. But it kept the fire lit, the shelves half full, and the local men quieter than they'd ever admit. Her tavern leaned slightly to one side like a tired house trying not to collapse from the weight of its own memories. The sign above the door was faded, the letters uneven, but everyone knew it. Everyone came, not for comfort, not even for the ale, but for the way she ran the place with silence and eyes that saw everything. She rose before the sun, feet wrapped in wool, shoulders stiff from sleeping near the fire. The floor creaked beneath her weight, the same 3 boards, every morning. She lit the first candle, checked the barrels, stirred the embers, ground the grain. Ale didn't brew itself. It needed tending, like a child, like a wound, and she had learned years ago how to do both. The back room smelled of yeast and thyme, damp stone, straw, and something sweet beneath the sour, the scent of fermentation, of quiet work done well. She didn't drink. Not often. Not anymore, but she understood the ale, what it meant, what it did. It numbed, softened, smoothed over things no one dared say out loud, and she served it with the same care a priest might offer a blessing. At midday, the men came, farmers with cracked hands, soldiers on leave, younger ones still pretending to be louder than their fears. They sat at crooked tables, boots caked in mud, eyes ringed with sleep, and she filled their mugs without needing to ask. She remembered every face, every fight, every secret spilled across these tables. She had watched romances begin and end here, watched a boy toast to his future, only to lose it to war, watched a man cry into his 5th mug after burying a child no one talked about. If you're enjoying this pace already, leave a soft like below and subscribe if you'd like more nights like this. She never interrupted, but she never forgot. They called her mother, sometimes. Half joking, half true, she let them, because it gave her power, not the loud kind. Not the kind written in law, but the quiet kind that mattered more. She knew who owed coin, who beat their wife, who couldn't read, who sang in their sleep, and with that knowledge, she ruled. No crown, no scepter, just a ladle, a broom, and the ability to look a man in the eye until he looked away. Her apron was always stained. Her hands smelled of hops. Her voice, when used, was low and steady. She didn't shout. She didn't need to. When a man grew too loud, too drunk, too brave, she stood beside him, said nothing, waited, and he left, because they all knew this was her place, her rules, her rebellion, and it had teeth. They didn't see it, of course. Not fully. They thought they were free here, that the ale loosened them, made them bold. But the truth, she had loosened them, poured just enough, held back when needed, guided the rhythm of the room like a silent conductor. She chose when to dim the lanterns, when to hum an old song, when to pour another round, and when to gently say, "That's enough now." And they listened, because even the strongest men knew when the alewife said stop, it was time to stop. She did all this without title, without praise, without a seat at the table when the real decisions were made, but in the hours between dusk and dawn, she had more power than any of them, not because she commanded, because she listened, because she remembered, and because they were a little afraid of her, not for what she might do, but for what she already knew. Night, when the last mug was washed and the fire burned low, she sat alone by the hearth. Her back ached, her feet throbbed. The silence pressed against her skin like a second apron. She sipped water, ran her hand over the grain of the table, closed her eyes. No one would sing her name. No statue would rise in her honor, but men left her tavern changed, softer, quieter, a little more afraid of themselves, and that, in its way, was a kind of revolution. Tomorrow they'd come again, with mud on their boots, and weight in their hearts, and she would be there, mug in hand, eyes sharp, ready, because not all rebellions shout. Some just pour the next round and wait. There was a time when laughter was harmless, a release, a ripple through the air that meant just for a moment things were safe, but not here. Not now. In the court, laughter was a gamble, a risk, measured not in sound, but in who was listening, and for the jester, laughter wasn't joy. It was survival. He stood again tonight in front of the same throne, beneath the same chandeliers that never seemed to gather dust. His bells jingled softly as he moved, a puppet sound, a sound meant to soothe. He had told this joke before, twice, maybe 3 times, but the king still liked it, or used to, or pretended to, and that made it dangerous, because a joke that used to bring laughter could now bring silence, and in this room, silence could kill. The courtiers laughed on. Cue. A little too loud, a little too quickly. Their eyes darted sideways toward the throne, toward the man who held not just power, but mood. The king's lips twitched. A flicker. No sound. The jester bowed, spun, made a face he'd crafted long ago in a mirror cracked along one edge. The same wide-eyed grin, the same absurd dance, the same performance, but tonight it felt different. He could feel it in his bones. The cold in the room wasn't from the fire. It still roared in the hearth. It was from the attention, the weight of eyes not amused, But waiting to see if the fool would step too far, he told another joke, riskier this time. A pun that bent a nobleman's name just slightly toward insult. The laughter was nervous, and the king? He smiled, but it wasn't warm. The jester bowed again, lower now. His joints cracked beneath the weight of performance. His knees kissed the floor not in reverence, but in fear. If you're still settling in, maybe leave a quiet like on this video and consider subscribing only if it feels right. Later, after the hall had emptied and the wine had run dry, the jester sat alone on the edge of his cot, still dressed, still painted. The bells on his collar didn't jingle now, they drooped like tired fruit. He rubbed his temples. Not from pain, from memory. He remembered the first time he'd made the king laugh. Really laugh. A belly-deep sound that shook the chandelier. He'd felt powerful then. Untouchable. Like a man with magic in his words. But that was years ago. The king had changed. The court had grown sharper, colder, hungrier, and laughter. Laughter had become a weapon. Some jesters used props. He did too, sometimes. A pig's bladder, a wooden chicken, a lute with only one string. But no matter the trick, the true performance was always the same. Make the king feel clever. Make the nobles feel safe. Make yourself invisible. He'd seen others fail. Once, a juggler slipped and dropped a plate. No one laughed. No one helped. By morning, the juggler had been sent away. Quietly. Without coin. Without shoes. Another time, a jester from a neighboring court visited, too bold, too fast. He mimicked the queen's limp. Just once. He was gone before sunset. The fool had learned slowly how to live between the lines, each jest a tightrope, each bow a bargain, each laugh a lie. But what else could he do? He had no land, no trade, just his tongue, and the dangerous things it could do. He washed his face with cold water. The paint came off in streaks, black around the eyes, red at the cheeks. A mask undone dot in the mirror, not the good one, but the bit of polished tin he kept nailed to the post. He saw himself, pale, lined, eyes older than they should be. He smiled, practiced it again and again, until it looked real, because tomorrow would come, and he would have to make them laugh again, whether they wanted to or not. By morning, the hearth had gone cold. No one meant for it to. The coals had simply given up in the dark. The wood too thin, the night too long. And now the gray ash sat like a quiet defeat beneath the grate. The child stared at it. She didn't cry. Crying wasted breath. Instead, she knelt down, nudged the ash gently with a stick, and searched for a coal that still whispered warmth. But there was nothing. The fire had died, and the house had followed. The walls breathed frost. The windows held their own breath in, trembling beads of condensation. In the corner, the baby fussed under 3 blankets, none of which were warm, only heavy. Mother stirred. Not awake, just less asleep. She blinked slowly, eyes puffy from too many nights without enough rest. Her hand searched for the clay kettle near the hearth, even before her eyes found it. Empty, of course it was. She sat up. A blanket slipped from her shoulder. The cold kissed her skin with a cruel familiarity. It had done that every morning this week. It was no longer a surprise, just another duty. She didn't curse, didn't sigh, just rose. Her skirt crackled from stiffness. Her back groaned softly. And the baby cried again, the smallest, weakest rebellion against a world that asked too much before breakfast. The older child had already put on her boots. One was missing its sole. The other had a hole at the toe. But they were still boots. Still hers. She didn't speak. She just stepped outside. The bucket at the well had frozen again. She cracked the top with a stick and lowered the pail. Her fingers were red before she'd even drawn water. Inside, her mother set the kettle on the cold hearth, not because there was heat, but because rituals matter, even when they're hollow. Especially then, the grain jar was low. 3 spoonfuls left. Maybe 4. She scraped what she could into a pot. Added water. Stir.it would taste like nothing, but it would. Fill their bellies. And that had to be enough. The baby had stopped crying. A worrying sign. She pulled him closer to the fire. Even though it was only a memory now, sometimes she swore he could feel the difference. Sometimes she hoped he couldn't, if you're enjoying this pace already. Leave a soft like below and subscribe if you'd like more nights like this. The older child came back in, face pink, lashes rimmed with frost. She placed 2 sticks on the hearth. One wet, one dry. Not enough to start a fire, but enough to mean she tried. Mother kissed her forehead without speaking. The kind of kiss that says, I see you. Thank you. The porridge was ready, or as ready as boiled grain water could be. She poured it into 3 chip bowls. The baby wouldn't eat, but they'd pretend he had. The illusion mattered. Especially for the girl, they ate slowly. Not to savor, but to delay hunger's return. Every few bites, the mother looked at the hearth. Still cold, still gray, still hollow. It reminded her of her husband's absence. Not death. Just absence. Gone to find work. Or food. Or both. Gone too long. He might return today. Or tomorrow. Or not at all. She didn't speak of him to the children. Didn't want her voice to crack. And cracks let the cold in. Instead, she fed them. Wiped their mouths. Pulled their hoods over their ears. And when they were settled, the girl brushing the baby's hair with a comb missing half its teeth, she went out back to chop wood. There wasn't much left, but there were a few logs, frozen, heavy. Reluctant, she lifted the axe, arms trembling from the cold and the ache, and brought it down again and again until splinters covered her skirts and her breath left clouds in the air. She brought in 1 log. Just one, enough for an hour's fire. Enough to warm the floor. Enough to remind the children that comfort hadn't vanished, not yet. The hearth crackled reluctantly. The baby stirred. The girl smiled a little. Mother sat by the fire and watched the flame climb the log like a pilgrim. Slow, hungry, hopeful, and for a moment the house felt full. Not of food, not of certainty, but of something like peace. Outside, the sky stayed gray. The trees stood still. But inside there was light, and the hearth, once cold, breathed again. Some humiliations are loud, public, final. Others are quieter daily. Repeated until they stop feeling like shame and start feeling like routine. In the corner of the room, under the bed or behind a curtain, sat the chamber pot, ceramic, if you were lucky. Tin, if you were common. Wood, if you were poor. It waited, still and patient, through the hours of the night. It never spoke, never asked, just existed, a quiet witness to all the ways dignity could be softened by cold, because when the wind howled and the hallways froze, no one walked to the privy in the dark. Not even lords. Everyone used the pot, the nobleman, wrapped in velvet, the maid, stiff from scrubbing, the child, half asleep with straw, still stuck in her hair. They all bent the same way, and in that small moment, whatever status the day had granted, Vanished because dignity, like warmth, was a luxury. The castle privy was a hole in a bench, stone-walled. Wind whistled. Dark even by day. It echoed. It smelled of mold and age and something worse. Rats lived there. So did shame. The pot at least lived inside. A woman in the servants' quarters once whispered that she dreamed of having a pot of her own. Not for use. For control, because the worst part wasn't the pot. It was waiting for it, holding in what the body begged to release, listening to the sound of someone else lifting the lid, hoping you'd get your turn before dawn. In winter, the pot was cold, so cold it stung. In summer, it buzzed with FLIs. No one liked to empty it, but someone always had to, usually the youngest, or the newest, or the one with no choice. They'd carry it arms stretched far from their chest. Down the servants' stairwell, out to the yard, behind the pig shed. If you were clumsy or unlucky, the contents would slosh. And if they sloshed onto your boots, or worse, your dress, there was no going back inside. You'd have to stay out until you were dry. Or until someone noticed. No one ever noticed. Children learned early how to empty them without complaint. It became a kind of right. A test. A measure of one's place in the world. No one who emptied a pot believed in grandeur anymore. If you're enjoying this pace already, leave a soft like below and subscribe if you'd like more nights like this. The queen used one too, though hers was gilded, painted with flowers, tended to by maids who turned away as she sat, but even her pot smelled the same in the morning, because waste doesn't care for titles. And neither does need. A jester once joked softly, after the king had retired, that no crown could cover what the chamber pot revealed. The room laughed, nervously, too loudly, and the next morning, the jester's name was never spoken again. But the pot remained. It always did. In some homes, people carved patterns into the handles, just to make them prettier, as if design could dignify the act, as if flowers painted on the side made the contents smell less sharp. It didn't, but it helped. A little, and sometimes that was enough. At night, when the wind moaned and the shutters shook, someone would rise. Quietly, carefully, they'd light a stub of candle, tiptoe past the sleeping bodies, lift the lid, breathe through their mouth, and squat, not because they wanted to, because they had to, and in that moment, with knees creaking and pride folded away, they would stare at the wall and think of anything else. Rain, bread, the warmth of hands, anything but this, because some needs are too human to bear in the light of day. So we tuck them into shadows, behind curtains, beneath beds, and we call it normal. When the pot was full, it had to be emptied. There was no delay, no escape, no later, and so the hands that cooked your food, dressed your wounds, or kissed your brow good night, were often the same hands that carried it out. That's what no one talks about. The people who made life livable did it all. The quiet tasks, the necessary ones, the ones that didn't belong in poems, but maybe they should have, because there is dignity still in care, even if it smells like ammonia and shame, even if it never gets thanks, and in that small, cold room where the pot waited each night silent, ugly, true something else waited too, endurance, a kind of grace no one teaches, just learned through need and repetition, and the quiet bravery of doing what must be done again and again. She didn't need a calendar to know the season. Winter spoke through the floorboards, through the ache in her knees, through the way the wind crept under the doorframe like a thief. Cold and certain, she rose before the frost had melted from the inside of the window glass. Her breath hung in the air, not like fog, but like memory. She'd always hated this season, not for its bite, but for its silence. There had once been 2 pairs of boots by the door, 2 chairs at the table, 2 spoons in the bowl. Now there was one. He had died quietly, not in war, not by plague, just worn down. Like the edge of a coin passed through too many hands. She remembered the final days well, not the grief, but the routine. How his breath had slowed. How his hands stayed warm long after the rest of him had gone. How the sun that rose the next morning didn't seem to notice anything had changed. The world never did. Now she tended to the house alone. The fire, the chickens, the walk to the stream and back. No one helped. No one asked if she needed anything. She'd become part of the scenery. A figure in a shawl. A woman with a bent back and quiet footsteps. People nodded at her, called her Mrs. or Poor Thing, but no one stayed to talk. Widows made people uncomfortable, not because they wept, but because they didn't, because they kept going. And that kind of strength frightened people. Her hands were strong, worn, red from cold, rough from rope. She tied bundles of kindling each morning with fingers that no longer felt the tips. She mended socks, baked bread from flour that smelled slightly off, swept a floor no one walked across but her. The days were long, the nights longer. She kept the hearth alive, though barely. A small fire, stingy with its warmth. She wore her husband's old coat over her dress. It still held the shape of his shoulders, still smelled faintly of earth and sweat and something like safety. Sometimes she spoke to it. To him, just a few words. Usually before bed, not prayers. Just conversation, what she had planted that day. What the neighbor's cow had done. What the boy in the next farm had broken this time. If you're enjoying this pace already, leave a soft like below and subscribe if you'd like more nights like this. She didn't expect an answer, but she left space for one. Just in case, the village women whispered about her. Not cruelly, just the way people do when they don't understand someone who carries themselves with stillness instead of sorrow. She's tough, they said. She's proud. She hasn't cried once. They were wrong, of course. She cried sometimes, but not at funerals. Not in daylight. She cried when a pot cracked in the cold, when she found his pipe tucked behind a beam, when she reached for another plate and remembered she only needed one. But most of all, she cried in the first thaw, when the icicles dripped and the roof began to weep, when the snow melted in uneven patches, when the earth gave up its dead things because winter had at least been honest. Cruel, yes, but honest. Spring made promises, and she had learned not to trust those. Still, she planted Dot in the back garden, a patch no larger than a blanket. She turned the soil, soft as breath, and placed seeds with fingers trembling. From cold, she didn't expect them all to grow, but she planted anyway, because life asked that of her, because he would have, and because in the end, grief had no loud exit. No final door. It lingered in socks, in spoons, in the way she turned toward. An empty chair with a comment half formed on her lips. That winter, she survived. Again, the roof held. The fire lasted. The stew stretched. She made it through, not with joy, not with ease, but with something deeper, something no one names, something only widows carry. In silence, in breath, in the daily defiance of not collapsing. One night, as snow fell in soft ribbons against the shutters, she sat by the fire and whispered, "You missed a cold one." Then she smiled, not because it was funny, but because it was true, and because the silence that followed felt less empty than usual. He had dreamed of armor, not the real kind, of course. Not the heavy iron plates passed down from noble to noble like sacred heirlooms. His armor was simpler, imagined, tied together with string, stitched from scraps, lined with stories told in hushed voices after chores were done. He was just a boy, and boys dreamed. Even poor ones, especially poor ones. In the morning, he carried buckets down the path to the well and back again. The handles bit into his fingers. The sloshing water soaked his sleeves. His boots, hand-me-downs from a cousin who'd outgrown them, rubbed raw at the heel. There were no swords, no galloping horses, just mud and stone, and a list of things that needed doing before the light ran out. Still, he dreamed. He carved a stick into a makeshift blade. Not sharp, but balanced. He tied a pot lid to his arm with twine. His helmet was a dented bucket with one handle broken off. He called himself Sir Nobody. The name made him smile. It felt true. He wasn't strong. Not yet. But he was fast. Clever. He could climb trees taller than the chapel and disappear into the hayloft before anyone could catch him. That had to count for something. He practiced at dusk, when no one was watching. Swung his stick at the air. Blocked invisible arrows. Defended the henhouse from imagined thieves. He narrated it all under his breath. A knight must protect the weak. A knight must never run. A knight must stand tall, even in the cold. Then his mother would call, and the game would end. Dinner was thin soup and crusts, the bowl still warm from her hands. She never asked about the stick, or the bucket, or the bruises from pretending to fall in battle, but she smiled when he placed the pot lid carefully back where it belonged, because even she had once dreamed. Maybe of silk, maybe of singing, but dreams, like armor, were heavy to carry past a certain age. If you're enjoying this pace already, leave a soft like below and subscribe if you'd like more nights like this. One day, the knight came through town. Not a pretend one, a real one. Horse tall and shined to mirror polish. Armor that clanked like thunder. Cape red as fire. Everyone stared. Everyone cheered. The boy didn't. He watched, quiet, still. Eyes sharp. The knight didn't smile. He didn't wave. He looked ahead, stiff in the saddle, as if he hadn't heard a laugh in years. As if his armor wasn't worn, but tired and in. That moment, the boy saw something he hadn't before. The knight wasn't a hero. He was a man, heavy with rules, hollow with duty. That night, the boy left the stick outside. It lay in the grass, forgotten, but not for long. By morning, the neighbor's dog had chewed it in two. Rain finished the rest. He didn't mourn it, not really. He still climbed trees, still ran fast, still carried buckets. But he no longer did it for glory, or pretend battles, or invisible dragons. He did it because the chickens needed water, because the roof leaked again, because his mother's hands had started to tremble when she kneaded dough, and that, he realized, was its own kind of knighthood. And no sword, no title, no horse, just quiet strength. And when he laid down to sleep, sore and silent, he still dreamed, but differently now. He dreamed of warm bread, of dry boots, of his mother's laughter returning just once before spring. And somewhere in the corner of that dream, a boy still held a stick, but not for fighting, for walking, because maybe, he thought, being strong didn't mean standing taller than everyone else. Maybe it meant carrying things no one else wanted to, and never putting them down. There was a time before soap, or rather, before soap was common. Before it sat in bowls by basins or lined shelves in fragrant bars. Before it meant lavender or softness, or the promise of being clean. In the village, being clean wasn't always wise. Sometimes it was dangerous. Sometimes it made you vulnerable, because dirt real, packed under your fingernails dirt, did more than mark a body. It protected it. A boy once washed his face before market. Just once. Just to see. He scrubbed with river water, rubbed until his cheeks glowed red. And when he arrived, the steward's son laughed, called him a girl, asked who he was pretending to be. He didn't wash again for weeks. Dirt was armor, not the kind you wore with pride, but the kind that kept questions away. The kind that said, I work. I'm no one. Leave me alone. Women caked it under their nails after pulling onions. Men wore it in their beards. Children painted their legs with it, just by walking. It settled into the folds of life, the way dust settles into corners quietly, completely, and bathing. Bathing was rare, not because they didn't care, but because water was cold. Time was scarce. And warmth, real warmth, was something you saved for food or fire, not skin. There was no tub in most homes. Just a basin, a rag, and a hope that no one would notice the smell. They didn't, because everyone smelled of wood smoke, of wool, of earth, sweat, and last week's work. If someone bathed too often, it meant something, that they had help, or secrets, or thought themselves better than the rest. No one liked that. The poorest stayed dirty out of necessity. But the wisest, they stayed dirty on purpose, especially in plague years, because then clean skin meant open pores. Open pores meant sickness, and sickness meant being left alone. Or worse. They rubbed garlic under their arms, wrapped herbs in cloth and wore them at their necks, and let the dirt stay. It wasn't just protection. It was camouflage. If you're enjoying this pace already, leave a soft like below and subscribe if you'd like more nights like this. Dirt didn't ask for anything. It didn't shame you. It didn't glare at your worn shoes or the holes in your sleeves. It let you be. It softened calluses, clogged cracks in cold fingers, warmed feet that had no socks, and when you lay down at night, in straw that scratched and a blanket that never fully covered your toes, it hugged you like an old coat. They say now that cleanliness is next to godliness, but then survival was next to godliness. And dirt came close behind. A woman who washed too often lost the oils in her skin. Her lips cracked. Her hands bled. Her children got cold more easily. A man who shaved every day got strange looks, as if he were waiting for someone important. As if he thought he was important. Dirt lowered expectations. And that, too, was a kind of safety. You could disappear. Into the fields. Into the crowd. You could go unnoticed, which meant unbothered. And in a world where nobles changed laws with a yawn, where taxes arrived faster than grain grew, where a sharp glance could change your whole day, being unbothered was a blessing. On feast days, they washed, not deeply, just enough. Face, neck, maybe behind the ears. They used soap boiled from ash and lard. It stung the eyes, peeled the skin, but it did the job. And when they entered the chapel, or the steward's hall, or the town square for the procession, they looked different, not cleaner, just newer, and that, too, passed quickly. By evening, the dirt returned. It always did, because dirt didn't mind being forgotten. It didn't leave a stain. It was the stain, and in that, it became something else. Something gentle. Something known. Children played in it, drew pictures with sticks, buried coins they pretended were treasure, then went home with blackened feet and tangled hair smiling. Old men scooped it with bare hands when burying fence posts, rubbed it between their palms, said, "Good earth," with the kind of reverence usually saved for saints, and when someone died, and they always did, eventually it was dirt that held them last. And no silk, no lace, just a wooden box, a shallow grave, and the earth tucking them in. So when people say they were dirty, yes, they were, but they were also warm, and cautious, and tired, and alive, and maybe, in the end, that's all anyone wants. To be held, to be left alone, and to walk through this world with a little shield between themselves and everything that would rather see them broken, even if that shield is made of dirt. There was a time when bells meant joy. They rang for weddings, for harvests, for the birth of a child in a home with too little food, but more than enough hope. They called neighbors to feast, called prayers to begin, called mourning into being. But then the plague came, and the bells changed. They rang longer. Now, lower, slower, a sound that seemed to drag across the sky like a sigh no one could finish. They rang for the dead. Again, and again, and again, until the sound no longer meant anything but lost. In the village, people stopped looking up when they heard them. They didn't count them anymore, didn't ask who it was for. It didn't matter. Today, it was the baker's boy. Yesterday, the old woman who fed birds. Tomorrow, maybe someone else. The bell tower stood on a hill just above the church, crooked slightly, as if it were leaning into the wind. The bell itself was large, iron, touched by rust and birds and years. The boy who rang it was young, too young. He hadn't been chosen. He had just become it. The last bell ringer had fallen sick. Then the one after that. Then the man who'd filled in just once. So the boy, whose father was gone and whose hands were strong, took up the rope, and now, every morning, every afternoon, and every time someone wrapped a body in cloth, it was him who pulled. He never looked at the faces. He didn't go inside the church. He just waited at the tower until someone nodded, and then he rang. The bell didn't resist. But it never came easy. Each pull dragged it into motion, slow and creaking. Then the chime, deep, hollow, final, not a song, a sentence. Sometimes he cried, quietly, but mostly he just counted. 1 toll, 2, 3. For the age of the soul departing, after a while, they stopped telling him how old the dead were. The bell rang 7 times one day for a child who had barely learned to walk. It rang 80 for a woman who'd outlived her own name. But to the boy, every toll sounded the same. Heavy, the village learned to live around the bells. They paused, mid-sentence, mid-step, mid-prayer, just for a moment, just long enough to bow their heads or press a palm to their chest, and then they continued, because grief had to be worn like clothing, layered, repeated, never fully washed. If you're enjoying this pace already, leave a soft like below and subscribe if you'd like more nights like this. One day, the bell didn't ring. The boy had stayed in bed too long. His arm hurt. His legs refused to lift. And for a few minutes, the sky was quiet. People noticed. They stood still, looked up at the hill, wondered if maybe finally there was no one to mourn. Then the door of the tower creaked, and the bell rang, not quite right. A beat too slow, a tone slightly off, but it rang, and that was enough. The boy never asked for coin, never asked for bread. But sometimes someone left a crust wrapped in cloth near the base of the tower, or a dried apple, or gloves. He accepted them all, not with thanks, just with need, because death had made him useful, and usefulness was the only protection anyone had now. At night, the bell swayed gently in the wind, even when it wasn't being pulled. It had learned the rhythm, had absorbed the grief, and sometimes in the dark, it groaned like it remembered something. The boy slept near it once, when his house grew too cold. Curled against the tower wall, he listened to the echoes of past tolls still vibrating in the stone, and in his sleep, he dreamed of silence. Not peace, not music, just nothing. No bells, no morning, no wait, but the morning came, as it always did, and the nod came, as it always did, and his hands found the rope, because someone had died, again, and even in a world without answers, the bell still knew what to say. In some corners of the world, prayer echoes. It rises in great halls. It's sung. It's shouted. It fills domes and rafters and robes, but in the village, prayer was quiet. It lived in whispers, in breaths, in spaces between shores. It didn't wear gold. It wore wool. You might hear it. At dawn, as a mother stirred the pot and murmured thanks for what little grain hadn't gone to rats. Or at dusk, when a shepherd laid down on cold stone and closed his eyes with a name on his lips, prayer wasn't a spectacle. It was survival, and it didn't always come in words. A man sharpening a blade too dull to matter, that was a kind of prayer. A girl tying a ribbon at the end of her braid just like her mother did, that was one too. They prayed not because they expected answers, but because silence without prayer was too empty. In the chapel small, cracked, always a bit too damp, the priest led morning service in a voice barely louder than a conversation. He didn't preach. He didn't thunder. He recited, lines worn smooth by repetition. Like a stone held in the hand too many times, most villagers couldn't read. But they knew their rhythm, knew when to bow, when to kneel, when to close their eyes, even if they didn't believe anything waited on the other side. Children mimicked the words with mismatched sounds. Elders just sat, hands folded, eyes open, listening to the wood creak, and still somehow it mattered, not because they expected miracles, but because prayer gave shape to pain. A container, a soft edge around something sharp. And a one brag about being devout. There was no reward for piety here, no indulgences sold, no feasts promised. The reward was only this: a little silence in the mind, a little warmth in the chest, and a reason, however small, to keep going. If you're enjoying this pace already, leave a soft like below and subscribe if you'd like more nights like this. Women prayed as they stitched, men prayed as they shoveled snow from doorways. The old widow whispered to the fire before bed. The stable boy muttered into his scarf before mounting the frostbitten cart, and when someone died, which happened often, prayers were not shouted over coffins. They were whispered into sleeves, into bread dough, into the stillness that came after the last guest left. Some prayers were angry, a clenched jaw, a slammed pail. Not words, exactly, but still holy. Others were more like bargains. If she lives, I'll never curse again. If the rain holds off, I'll light a candle every week. If I can just make it through the night. God didn't always answer, but the act of asking helped. A girl once knelt in the garden and asked for a miracle. Nothing happened, but she stood afterward and weeded anyway. That was prayer, not the hope that something would change, but the strength to go on when it didn't, and on the coldest nights, when the wind cried through the walls and the candle flickered and you were sure, absolutely sure, that you couldn't endure another hour. You whispered, not to be heard, but to not be alone, because sometimes prayer wasn't for God. It was for the self, the scared part, the small voice that still wanted something more, and so they whispered. in kitchens, in stables, in fields, in beds that had seen too many winters and too few comforts. They whispered through cracked lips and closed doors and broken hearts, and the world vast and unkind as it could be felt just a little less loud afterward, a little more bearable, a little more sacred. There was no announcement, no cry through the hall, no gasp from the nobles or whisper from the steward. The jester simply didn't appear. No bells, no jokes, no crooked bow or painted grin. The throne room felt colder that morning. Not for lack of fire, the hearth still roared, but for something else. Something missing. They waited at first. The courtiers in their silks seated just so. The king fidgeting with a goblet he didn't drink from. A hush lingered longer than it should have. A page was sent. Then a second. Then silence again. No one knew where he'd gone. His room was empty. The straw bed still dented. The wash basin untouched. His hat, the foolish one with bells at each point, sat folded neatly on the stool, as if placed there deliberately, as if to say, I was here. But no longer. No note, no trail, no goodbye, just absence. And in that absence, something shifted. No one spoke of him that day. The king did not request laughter. The musicians played early and left quickly. Even the servants tiptoed more than usual. A tea wasn't grief. Not exactly, just unease, because when someone disappears without a sound, it forces everyone to wonder, what did we miss? What did we do? The jester had always been there. Like the drapes, like the creak in the floorboard near the west wing. A fixture, a familiar color in the daily gray. He'd told jokes when no one felt like laughing. He'd danced when the mood was heavy. He'd insulted the powerful with a wink that made them feel like they were in on it even when they weren't. And now his absence rang louder than his laughter ever had. If you're still settling in, maybe leave a quiet like on this video and consider subscribing only if it feels right. The cook noticed it first. The missing plate. For years, the jester had eaten late, always alone. A bowl of broth, a heel of bread, a piece of apple, if one was soft enough to spare. She placed it out that night anyway, just in case, but in the morning, it was still there, cold, untouched. The guards grumbled that he'd likely run off, taken coin or secrets, but no one searched for him. Not seriously, because deep down they knew if he had wanted to be found, he would have left a trail, a rhyme, a joke pinned to the wall, a final pun on a silver platter, but he hadn't. He had vanished the way laughter sometimes does, suddenly, without warning, leaving behind only quiet. In the following days, no one took his place. Another jester was sent for eventually, from a city far off, but he never quite fit. Too loud, too polished, too safe. The king laughed once, politely, but it wasn't the same, because the last jester had known things. Not just jokes, but rhythms. The subtle tilt of a moment, the pulse beneath the performance. When to speak, when to mock, when to say nothing at all. That was the real art, and it could not be replaced. Some said they saw him in a village miles away, that he'd traded in his bells for a shepherd's staff, that he sang now to sheep. Others claimed he joined a monastery, that he now copied holy texts in silence. The loudest thing about him, the stain on his fingertips. But most believed nothing at all. They just remembered the crooked smile, the sideways glance, the way he made a room feel lighter even when it wasn't. And sometimes, on long winter nights, when the fire flickered and the mood grew heavy, the nobles would glance at the door just once, as if he might walk in again, not with fanfare, just quietly, with a joke, with a bow, with that look that said, "I know more than I let on." But he never came back, and so the court moved on. As courts do, the fire was stoked. The music played. The king forgot to notice, but in the farthest corner of the hall where the shadows stayed thick and the light rarely reached, there remained a stool, empty, waiting. Unclaimed, the world was never quiet. Not really, even in the deepest part of night. There were sounds, the wind brushing past shutters, the creak of beams settling into the weight of their own age, the sigh of someone shifting beneath a worn blanket, but somehow they slept, not easily, not luxuriously, but they slept in cottages with thatched roofs that leaked when the sky turned mean, in haylofts where the straw scratched and the mice whispered their little teeth through sacks of grain, on pallets stuffed with rags, on dirt floors warmed by nothing but the bodies beside them. They slept, not because they were comfortable, but because they were tired from carrying water, from digging trenches, from spinning thread until their fingers bled, from waiting, always waiting for the season to turn, for the fever to pass, for the next mouth to stop crying. Sleep didn't come with pillows. It came when the body gave in. The blacksmith fell asleep, still holding his apron, soot in the creases of his eyes. The washerwoman dozed sitting upright, her skirts still damp, hands still raw. The child curled up near the hearth, wrapped in a cloak that didn't belong to her. And no lullabies. No bedtime rituals, just sleep, the kind that rises like fog from the ground. Slow, reluctant, but full. Even the jester, when he still lived in the castle walls, slept in fragments. A nap stolen in the corner of a cold room, his hat still on, a joke still forming in his mind, even as his body surrendered. There was no shame in sleep, because it was the only escape they had. From taxes, from hunger, from aches no poultice could touch. In sleep, the widow was not alone. In sleep, the child wasn't afraid. In sleep, the world softened. They dreamed not of paradise, but of relief, a warm loaf, a dry roof, a summer that lasted longer than usual. And sometimes they didn't dream at all, just floated, weightless, unbothered. The rats didn't wake them. The cold didn't wake them. Even the sorrow of the day before couldn't rouse them. Once the breath deepened and the hands unclenched, they had earned this stillness. It wrapped around them like a second skin. No silk, no feathered blankets, just presence, just surrender. And still through all of it they slept. If you're enjoying this pace already, leave a soft like below and subscribe if you'd like more nights like this. The world moved on around them. Owls called through black trees. Rain tapped the roof like a patient visitor. A fox padded through the dark, unseen and certain, but inside those walls, behind thin doors and under patched quilts, the sleepers did not stir. They had learned, over lifetimes, how to find rest even when nothing else was restful. They slept when there was nothing left to do, when the pot was empty, when the tears had dried, when the candle burned to its end. And in that sleep was something sacred, not escape entrance, because in the morning the baby would cry again. The fire would need coaxing. The fields would call, and they would answer. But for now they breathed, steady, soft, together, even when they were alone, and the world, vast and wide and too often cruel, paused just for a little while, because even grief must rest, even worry must sleep, and even in the hardest centuries, behind the hardest walls, in the hardest lives, they closed their eyes, and still they slept. Laughter was not always loud. Sometimes it arrived sideways, tucked into the corners of a shared glance, or slipped between chores like honey and tea. Soft, fleeting. Real dot in the medieval world, laughter did not live in theaters or echo from golden balconies. It lived beside bread, ovens, at the back of the market, in the cold corner of a bed shared by too many people and not enough blankets. It wasn't joyful in the way we think of joy now. It was something else. Laughter was a defense, a refusal, a rebellion of spirit, because what else could you do when the boots didn't fit, the stew didn't stretch, and the roof leaked in 3 new places before sunrise? You laughed, not always with sound, but with breath. A huff, a snort, a smirk that said, yes, this is ridiculous. And yes, I'm still here. The jester knew this better than anyone. Not the polished ones in stories, the real ones. The ones who performed for bread. Who danced because it was safer than disagreeing. Their laughter wasn't silly. It was strategic. It let them say things no one else could. Point out the rot with a rhyme. Mock the powerful gently so the powerless could breathe. And when the laughter landed, when the court echoed and the king's cup trembled, they bowed, but they never laughed with them, because they knew laughter is a weight. It holds things we don't know how to say. It carries grief dressed up in noise. It breaks silence so silence doesn't break us. Even the villagers laughed. Especially them. A woman scraped soot from the chimney and muttered that it had more personality than her late husband. A man limped back from the field and claimed the earth was jealous of his knees. A child chased a chicken across the yard and shouted, "You'll never be soup," though they all knew it would, and somehow that made it easier. They weren't mocking life. They were surviving it, because sometimes the only thing more dangerous than sorrow was silence, and laughter. Even the tiniest crack of it let the light in. It's easy to imagine medieval life as one long ache, and in many ways it was, but it was also full of quiet joys, private smiles, moments of absurdity that felt like oxygen, a slipper frozen to the floor, a goat stuck in a bucket, a nobleman stepping in something undignified. And in those moments, laughter wasn't just an escape, it was proof they were still human, still soft, even when the world was not. Even the monks laughed, not often, and never loudly. But still, they copied sacred texts with ink-stained fingers, eyes burning from candlelight, and sometimes in the margins they drew cats, or demons picking their noses, or saints riding pigs, not to offend, but to remember that joy, too, was holy. And the tailor laughed, and the widow, and the shepherd, and the blacksmith who hadn't slept in days. They laughed at things no one else would find funny, because pain sharpens humor, and repetition dulls the senses until absurdity is the only thing left with edges. A child once asked his mother why people laughed if things weren't funny. She didn't answer right away. She handed him bread that was smaller than usual, looked at the rain falling into the pot she'd placed beneath the leak, smiled, and said, "Because if we don't laugh, we'll forget how. If you're still settling in, maybe leave a quiet like on this video and consider subscribing only." If it feels right, the jester in the end understood this best. Not the jokes, not the dance, but the weight, because laughter was never just noise. It was history, poured out between cracked teeth, and now, centuries later, it still echoes through letters, through songs, through the worn carvings on benches and the crooked smile of a puppet in a museum. Laughter remains. It tells us that they were here, not just as names, not just as bones buried beneath cold stone, but as people, tired, hungry, hopeful, hilarious. And so tonight, if your eyes are closing and your breath has softened and your blanket feels just warm enough to stay, let this be the last thing you Remember that once, long ago, in a world colder than ours, but strangely familiar, they laughed, and because they did, we can too, softly, quietly, with the kind of strength that doesn't need to be loud, the kind that carries you through the winter and into morning.